Pokemon Colosseum is one of the more niche games in the franchise, and because of that, documentation on the game's mechanics has been a bit sparse online, especially on YouTube. Sure, you might be able to find what you're looking for in a 15-year-old GameFAQs thread, but come on, every minute topic needs a video you can eat to, it's the rules. To be precise, I haven't seen much video documentation on the game's central mechanic, Shadow Pokemon, which is kinda bizarre to me because they're deceptively in-depth. In fact, some of the things I'll talk about today are either completely undocumented or existing sources have misinformation regarding them. Hi, my name is Sparkle, I am a top-level Colosseum speedrunner, and I'm gonna tell you everything I know about Shadow Pokemon. You ready? Before I get into the nitty-gritty, I'm gonna explain what Shadow Pokemon are in the context of Colosseum, because there's a solid chance it's not what you're familiar with. In the story, Shadow Pokemon are stronger, emotionally unstable versions of regular Pokemon that only care about battling. They were made by criminal organization Cypher in order to essentially create a monopoly on Pokemon tournaments. Cypher oversees all the Colosseums in the Ori region, and their main plot is to plant Shadow Pokemon in impoverished locations to build up their culture of battling from the roots of society. Is this real? Using the Snag Machine, the player is meant to steal Shadow Pokemon and eventually purify them in Relic Forest, restoring them to their original forms. In gameplay, Shadows stick out like a sore thumb. They're all purple, they have this weird experience bar, they only know one move. Where do we even begin? Well, let's just start with catching a Shadow. When an enemy trainer sends out a Shadow Pokemon, you get a very obvious visual cue from your partner character, Rui. A lot of people meme on this cutscene for being drawn out and stupid looking, but one thing I like about it is that when Rui blinks, you can see her shadow vision turn on, which I think is cool. And it reminds me of this image. Yeah. Afterwards, the Shadow's border turns purple and they're able to be caught. Many Pokemon have had their catch rates altered specifically for Colosseum. These changes are mainly to make early game Shadows easier to catch and late game Shadows harder to catch. It also makes some of the obscenely low catch rates a bit more accessible. And then we have the Japan-exclusive e-reader Shadows that all have a catch rate of 45. I don't know why. In total, there are 48 catchable Shadow Pokemon in Colosseum. They basically act as the game's replacement for wild Pokemon, having their own version of the Pokédex in the snag list, and also sharing traits such as natures, random IVs, shininess, etc. There's only one relevant difference between them, which is that Shadows actually have the trainer ID of the AI before being caught. A well-known consequence of this is that Shadows that appear shiny in battle can turn back to normal in the player's party. Taking a look at the summary screen, this is already far different from what a regular Pokemon would look like. The OT, Trainer ID, and Nature are unknown, and the experience bar is replaced with this purple meter known as the Heart Gauge. Looking at the Moves tab, we can see that the only one available is Shadow Rush, a move exclusive to the Ori region games. Before I get into these more in-depth mechanics, I'll first go over some basic traits about Shadow Pokemon. They cannot learn TMs, be given nicknames, or use the move deleter, and they also can't be entered in Fennec Colosseum in story mode or any battle mode challenges from the main menu. Last and most importantly though, they cannot level up. This significantly affects their use in battle over time, as they'll start falling off the further you progress. The game somewhat balances this by having Shadows be a relatively high level at the time of their encounter, but you're still heavily encouraged to purify them so they can catch up or even evolve. As an aside, I think this is really cool from a storytelling perspective. Shadow Pokemon are meant to be tools for battling, but their inability to grow means that they'll eventually have to be replaced with stronger ones, which reinforces Cypher's ideology of using Pokemon for profit. Oh my god, they're Apple. So with the basics out of the way, let's dive into the real grease mines that are the main mechanics of Shadow Pokemon, beginning with the Heart Gauge. After being caught, Shadows start with their Heart Gauges completely full. Through various methods, it will slowly decrease over time, and upon being empty, Shadows can be purified. You can also use an item called a Time Flute to summon Celebi and have your Shadow be purified on the spot, skipping the entire Heart Gauge process. Every Shadow Pokemon has a set Heart Gauge amount. Each time a condition for decreasing the gauge is met, a number is subtracted from this amount, and the goal is to reach 0. Basically, the bigger it is, the longer it takes to purify. The first few Shadows have the shortest heart gauges at 3,000, while by the late game they end up at 7,000, requiring twice as much investment to purify. Shadows caught in boss fights, however, have far larger gauges, going up as high as 20,000 for the final boss. To lower the heart gauge, there are 4 different methods. First up is just sending out your Shadow in battle. This method is simple, but can only be done once per fight. You can't abuse it by switching back and forth, so it's relatively inefficient for grinding. The second method is walking 128 steps in the overworld with your Shadow in the party, which is called a step cycle. Now, Colosseum isn't a tile-based game, so it's hard to tell what a step even is, but from my testing, a step cycle takes roughly 42 seconds of movement. This method also works when your shadow is in the daycare, which I somehow did not know until recently. Conveniently, there's a secret spot in Agate Village where you can just hold down and easily grind step cycles, with a bonus of frontal lobe trauma. The third method is giving a shadow a cologne massage, which can be done by obtaining the cologne case from this NPC and then purchasing scents to use at the Agate Village Pokemart. There are 3 different types of scents: Joy, Excite, and Vivid. The only differences between them are cost and effectiveness. Some of my math magicians out there would have already figured out that Joy scents are a complete ripoff, while Excite and Vivid scents scale the same. So in short, just don't buy Joy scents. Lastly, the 4th method is to use the call command on a shadow while it's in hyper mode, a unique condition which I'll go more into later. So I explained how to perform these methods, but what about the numbers behind them? How much do they actually subtract from the heart gauge?
You're not ready yet!
As the heart gauge decreases, shadows will gradually unlock various repressed traits. For every bar that gets depleted, one of these traits is restored. At bars 1, 3, and 4, shadows unlock their 2nd, 3rd, and 4th move slots respectively. Movesets for shadows are generally a mix of level up moves, learnable TMs and HMs, and even egg moves, although some have it way better than others. At bar 2, shadows begin gaining experience from battle. Before this point, any experience that would be earned just goes to the void, but shadows do still take a split of it. This experience can't be accessed until they're purified, as they still can't level up. One thing to note is that shadows don't gain EVs from KOs, but you can use vitamins on them. Thank God, I was worried about my Quilava's folic acid level. The other effect of clearing 2 bars is that the shadow's nature is revealed in the summary screen. Remember that. At all 5 bars, there's no additional features besides being able to be purified. When a shadow is purified, a few things happen besides becoming a regular Pokemon again. They relearn their first move slot, permanently forgetting Shadow Rush, the experience they earned from battle is earned all at once, and they get a special purification ribbon. Wholesome. That's all I have on the heart gauge for now, so let's move on to what I think is one of the most interesting moves in Pokemon: Shadow Rush. Shadow Rush is the only move that Shadow Pokemon initially have access to. It's a 90 base power physical attack that deals recoil to the user. Its type is labeled as Shadow in the game, but functionally it's just typeless like Struggle, hitting neutrally into every matchup. Now, this is normally where I would move on to the next mechanic, but it turns out there's something kind of strange about this move. You see, everywhere I've looked online documents the recoil damage as being 1/16 of your max HP. From my time speedrunning Colosseum though, I realized that this isn't exactly true. Here's an example. My Quilava in this run has 79 HP, so it should always be taking 4 damage of recoil from Shadow Rush. However, what happens instead is that it takes anywhere from 3 to 5 damage of recoil seemingly at random, and there doesn't seem to be any reason behind it. This had me confused for years, and I never found any info about it, so I finally decided to buckle down and do some testing. Unfortunately, I am not a software engineer, so looking at the game's code was out of the question. What I ended up doing was catching Entei as a test subject. I did this because I wanted to figure out if the recoil variance was any different based on the user's max HP, and Entei has a lot. But when I tested it, I found that it was actually the same case as Quilava. Along with the supposedly intended recoil of 9, I would also get 8 and 10, the 2 numbers before and after the output of the equation, respectively. I ended up shadow rushing 100 times to get a good data sample, which took a while, but the results were worth it. Entei took 8 recoil 31 times, 9 recoil 36 times, and 10 recoil 33 times. So here's my scuffed conclusion from this experiment. When Shadow Rush recoil damage is calculated, the game takes 1/16 of your max HP as a base, and is then either 1 in 3 to increase it by 1, 1 in 3 to decrease it by 1, or 1 in 3 to do neither. Now, this research could be more fine-tuned, and I could have missed something, but it does at least give a better idea of how Shadow Rush recoil actually works that was previously undocumented, so yay, good job, YouTuber. So with that all settled, let's move on to the next mechanic of Shadow Rush that's way more important than this. In Pokemon Colosseum, when a Shadow Pokemon uses Shadow Rush, they have a chance of entering a unique condition known as Hyper Mode. This is indicated by this animation followed by the Shadow's HUD plate turning red and black. There are 4 main effects of being in Hyper Mode, 1 positive and 3 negative. I'll go over the drawbacks first. When Hyper Mode is initially triggered, it's treated as the Shadow's action for the turn, so they don't get to attack. Second, you can't use items on a Shadow in Hyper Mode except for Sense. The only way to heal it is by using a healing machine. Lastly, if you attempt to use a move that isn't Shadow Rush, your Shadow might disobey and do one of multiple different actions, which I'll briefly list right now.
The Shadow may use any of the moves it currently has unlocked, and if that move is an attack, then it will randomly target something on the field, which can include your own teammate. The Shadow may attack either the player character or the opposing trainer, which doesn't do anything besides look funny. The Shadow may hit itself in confusion. The Shadow may succumb to decision paralysis.
This is getting oddly personal.
And last, the Shadow may force itself back into its ball, effectively switching out. Now on Bulbapedia it states that Shadows can attempt to use a held item even if they don't have one, but I wasn't able to replicate this, nor have I ever seen footage of it, so if anyone has more info then please let me know in the comments. All around, these negative effects of Hyper Mode generally seem to incentivize the player to only use Shadow Rush, and there's a very good reason for that. When in Hyper Mode, the critical hit rate for Shadow Rush skyrockets to 90.625%. More on that in a bit. This one trait makes up for all the annoying drawbacks, as this lets Shadows deal insane damage output for Gen 3 standards. In the speedrun, we heavily rely on Hyper Mode in the early game to pick up 1-hit KOs with Quilava, and Quilava's attack stat isn't even good. It's just critting with a 90 power move in a game where crits do ×2 damage is kinda broken. Now, Shadow Rush's crit rate in Hyper Mode has also been a victim of shaky documentation over the years. Bulbapedia currently states it's 95%. Speedrunners have since pinned it down to 90.625%, but why this bizarre number? So, from how I understand it, the game just flat out gives Shadow Rush a 90% crit rate in Hyper Mode as if it's a secondary effect of the attack. This notably does not overwrite the native crit rate of 6.25%. So when the secondary effect of 90% fails to proc, that 6.25% is still fair game. In this case though, these odds are divided by 10 because only 10% of Shadow Rushes can crit in this way. So in total, this comes out to 90.625%. Now to have some form of tangible data, I tested some more Shadow Rushes right after the recoil experiment, but with a slightly higher sample size this time. I Shadow Rushed 500 times. Yes, I love eating dirt. Out of the 500 rushes, I crit 454 times, which is a 90.8% rate. So yeah, that's pretty convincing. Lastly, I want to go over how to cure Hyper Mode, of which there are a few ways. The main method is using the call command in battle. This also has the added bonus of decreasing the heart gauge a bit, as mentioned previously. The other methods are a lot more niche, and they're as follows. Leaving your shadow at the daycare, using a scent on it, and having it faint. There's one last method, and it's stupid, so shadows have a chance of coming to their senses during their turn, leaving Hyper Mode entirely on their own. Notably, you do not get the heart gauge bonus when this happens. The chance of this happening? 1 in 256. I am not lying. In a casual setting, all this would really do is make you go, huh, that was weird. But if this happens to you in a speedrun? So you may have noticed I'm purposefully withholding information again. I haven't actually told you what the chance of triggering Hyper Mode is yet. Before that though, hey, I'm not going to be stopping with Colosseum content, so make sure you like and subscribe if that interests you. Thank you. Right, so let's talk about natures. So we all know how natures work, right? Each Pokemon is randomly assigned one, and they can influence your stats, and there's 25 in total, yada yada. Now, natures in Gen 3 games are kind of funny, because since it was the generation they were introduced in, they wanted them to be a little extra special. In Ruby and Sapphire, natures play a huge role in raising your Pokemon for contests, but all they really determine is what kind of Pokeblocks your Pokemon like to eat. It's not too complicated. However, as for Pokemon Colosseum,
Pardon me while I go die.
Each of the 25 natures in the game have their own unique heart gauge stats and Hyper Mode trigger rates. If you've played this game, you may have felt at some point that some shadows would take way longer to purify than others, and some would just never enter Hyper Mode at all. There is a very strong chance it had something to do with their natures. Now this chart is a lot to take in, but I'm gonna try and explain it the best I can. Let's start small by understanding how one nature works. In this example, I'll be looking at Brave. Here we can see the stats for each heart gauge decreasing method. Whenever one of these methods is satisfied, the associated value with it is subtracted from the heart gauge. So with a Brave nature, each time the shadow is sent out into battle, it will lower the gauge by 200, completing a step cycle will lower the gauge by 150, and calling it out of Hyper Mode will lower the gauge by 225. As for the Sense method, it depends on the type of scent you use. Joy Scents are the base, so it would just be 75 like shown, but an Excite Scent has a ×2 multiplier, so it'd be 150 instead, and Vivid Scents have a ×3 multiplier, so it'd be 225. Now let's move on to the Hyper Mode rates. Each bar of the heart gauge has its own unique trigger rate. Looking at Brave, we can see that the highest chance is during the first bar at 50%, and it then steadily decreases for each one, all the way down to 5% when the gauge is empty. Now, each nature's hypermode rates aren't entirely unique. There's actually only 6 different tables in the game dispersed among the 25 natures. Table 1 is the one I just went over, so yeah.
Table 1, please.
Table 2 is similar to Table 1, except it doesn't decrease as much the further it goes. It even remains stagnant between bars 2 and 3. Table 3 is one of the lower odds tables, maxing out at 30 initially and then decrementing by 5 for each subsequent bar. Table 4 is very pathetic, only having a 20% chance of entering hypermode at best. Table 5 is definitely the strangest. It starts at 30%, but then shoots up to a staggering 70% for 3 consecutive bars before going down to 50 and then 25. And finally, Table 6 is just 50s across the board. I call it the Misty.
Shoot yourself!
I will not be going over each nature's heart gauge rates because we'd be here forever, so I left a link to the chart in the description if you want to take a look for yourself. So all around, does knowing any of this information actually help with gameplay? Well, that depends. If you're a normal person, no. Remember how I said that the Shadow's nature is hidden until the 3rd bar of the heart gauge? This means you don't actually know your heart gauge stats or hypermode rates for almost half the time you have the Shadow. That kinda sucks. Now, you can technically estimate what natures your Shadow could be by keeping an eye on the heart gauge, but if you're trying to purify Shadows efficiently, then here's my advice. Go to the secret spot, replug your controller while holding up, and then just let it rip for 30 minutes while you go do something else. No, this sheet isn't necessarily for casual players, it's for speedrunners. In the any % speedrun, we catch the Shadow Quilava at the beginning of the game to be our secondary main attacker. We cannot RNG manipulate its stats in nature like we can with Espeon, so we kinda just have to adapt. No matter what though, there's one major benchmark we must reach by a certain point. Start gaining experience before we beat Pyrite Colosseum. This is because if we start gaining experience after this point, we won't have enough to immediately evolve into Typhlosion after being purified, which would cause a lot of issues. The main method we use to lower the heart gauge faster is by calling out of hyper mode, as we can do it multiple times per battle. However, this process heavily depends on Quilava's nature, as they all have wildly varying heart gauge stats. The Colosseum speedrunning community developed an in-depth spreadsheet that details how each nature optimally plays out their heart gauge. This includes how many calls are needed, when you start earning experience, and when you unlock Flame Wheel, which is also significant. Now, before I go any further, you might have some very reasonable questions that I need to address. Hey Tuber, didn't you just say that you can't see natures until bar 3? How would you be able to plan things out from the start as if you did know your nature then? Well, in short, we kinda cheat. We use a special program made for Colosseum speedrunning that knows all the possible RNG seeds in the game. Basically, if we input the stats of the Quilava we caught, we can find its profile in our seed's RNG path, telling us its IVs, hidden power, and crucially, its nature. I skipped over a lot of information, but in general, that's what you need to know. So as far as explaining how each nature works, I made a tier list ranking all 25 natures in the Colosseum speedrun. Note that Quilava's special attack is very important, so we can't afford to run natures that lower it. To summarize, having to call more is bad because that's more turns you have to commit to grinding the heart gauge down. The best natures in the run have the highest battle and step cycle rates, which ideally lets them skip calling altogether. I'm really only scratching the surface of Shadow Quilava's presence in the speedrun, so if you want to learn more, I dropped a link to the Colosseum speedrunning Discord in the description. Feel free to ask any questions, we'd appreciate it. And that's everything I know about Shadow Pokemon in Colosseum. I did not bring up XD Gale of Darkness at all, and that's because Shadows were completely revamped in that game, which would require a whole nother video to explain. Maybe soon, if I feel like it. But regardless, I really hope you enjoyed watching. The channel has been growing insanely fast, and it really warms my heart to see all the excitement for Colosseum, so thank you all, I really appreciate it. And with that, I hope you have a great day. Bye bye.